So my dragons are at home, sorry. What do US President Barack Obama, British Prime Minister David Cameron and former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard have in common, apart from being leaders of nations? All three are on record as being huge fans of the HBO TV series Game of Thrones. Julia Gillard has even been known to tweet in Dothraki, the adopted language of Daenerys Targaryen, the show's exiled female leader. Now, we all know that Game of Thrones has been praised for its performances, its amazing scripts, and its production values. But what else does it have that would cause world leaders to say not just that they love it, but that they love it because it reminds them of their jobs? And the answer is its politics, which are both medieval yet also deeply familiar. Viewers everywhere have recognised the modern world in the show's deposed Eastern regimes, its decadent Western kingdoms, its centralised banking system, its religious fanatics, and its endless cycle of violence and turmoil. And Game of Thrones is far from alone in combining medieval and modern politics. Rather, the program is popular partly because the Middle Ages already loom large in the political imaginary of the 21st century. And my team of international researchers are proving, and this is our big idea, that the Middle Ages are indispensable. Ideas about the Middle Ages are indispensable to how we think about the modern world. Of course, these ideas are deeply conflicted. For some, medieval means barbaric, primitive, and oppressive. For others, it signifies the pure, the pious, and ideal communities. And these ideas also often have little to do with the historical Middle Ages. Rather, they're a kind of shorthand that expresses people's hopes and fears about what the modern world is and what it might become. A striking index of the rise of the medieval can be seen in the records of government. And this graph, containing data from British Hansard, which is the transcripts of parliamentary debate in the UK, shows a really extraordinary jump from 2001 in the use of the word medieval, and this trend has been repeated in the US and also in Australia. But what gave rise to this dramatic increase? The answer is the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center. Despite the high-tech planning and blockbuster choreography of this attack, its link to the Islamist terror group Al-Qaeda led to it being condemned as medieval by politicians and by the media. And since that time, it's become a reflex to describe Islamist groups as medieval, even though the fundamentalism of many of these groups is a relatively recent phenomenon. Now, this habit has a long history. The term medieval was first used in the Renaissance to celebrate that period's sense of its own progress in contrast to the era that preceded it. And this has been one of history's most successful acts of negative branding, because since that time, the Middle Ages have come to stand in for everything that we believe to not be modern. Added to this is the Western tendency to imagine the East as somehow outside of progress in history. When commentators and politicians today describe Islamist groups as medieval, they are distancing them from the here and the now, placing them into an oppressively religious past where people have not evolved into modern political actors. And so the post-9/11 usage of the word medieval tells us as much about Western political thought as it does about the ideologies of Islamist groups. Intriguingly, some of the key developments in global politics that are normally described as postmodern have also attracted the label medieval. And this is the case with the emerging transnational complexion of world politics. It's not news to anyone here that our global political landscape is populated by organisations whose authority crosses national borders and sometimes places pressure on the sovereignty of individual nations. And some of those organisations are displayed up here on the slide. What might be news to you, though, is that some international relations theorists have described this political landscape as neo-medieval, likening it to such formations as medieval Christendom and even the Holy Roman Empire. Enthusiasts have seen this neo-medieval order as ushering in an era of transnational cooperation. Critics, however, speak ominously of a world in which nations will be encroached upon by global powers and then return to a kind of medieval fragmentation. And this last view has had some disturbing and high-stakes ramifications, especially in relation to transnational terror organisations. The torture memos signed by the US Secretary of State in 2002, for instance, labelled al-Qaeda and the Taliban as feudal and tribal organisations, arguing that since their members worked within non-national medieval structures, they could be deemed non-state combatants and therefore denied the rights granted to prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. And of course, today, the question of enforced statelessness for combatants has returned as an issue in contemporary politics, Australia and elsewhere. What this reminds us is that international communities that are united by religious belief can also be counted among the organisations described as neo-medieval. The shaping force of religion in global politics over the last 15 years has not only increased markedly, but has also taken on a very distinctly medieval profile. IS's declaration of a new Islamic caliphate last year is a clear case in point. It's true that IS's notion of a fundamentalist Islamic Middle Ages bears little relationship to the historical record, which reveals the diverse and often tolerant forms of Islamic governance that grew up in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean. It's also true that their pursuit of statehood owes as much to modern ideas about sovereignty as it does to the history of the caliphates themselves. But what's significant here is that what we see is the attempt to form a political community based directly on precedents spanning from the 7th to the 15th century. The Catholic Church, too, has recently been emphasising its relationship to its medieval past. And one of the areas in which this has been played out is in the name and the unassuming bearing of the current Pope Francis, both of which are clear nods to the medieval saint Francis of Assisi, who's known for his simplicity, his love of the poor, and his love for the environment. And so what the Pope's doing in taking on this persona and making this historical reference is suggesting that the Church's medieval past is in some way relevant to the way it's going to address contemporary challenges for the environment and also society. The Middle Ages even show up in discussions of the global economy. Even though modern capitalism could not seem more different from the feudal economies of the late Middle Ages with their static hierarchies and their agrarian base, the term neo-feudalism is persistently used by critics to describe the modern economy. But what do they mean by this? As this satirical graphic shows, feudalism works as a historical analogy to condemn the massive inequities of wealth and power that are emerging under global capitalism. By applying the standard pyramid image of feudalism also to capitalism, it's claiming that despite our fantasies of economic mobility, the system under which we live is in fact as hierarchical and oppressive as the medieval system it has replaced. Now, some critics even suggest that while the feudal system was based, at least in theory, on relations of mutual dependence between serfs, vassals and lords, today's flexible labour market means that workers experience the poverty of the medieval peasant, but without the security. Similarly, the bankers placed at the top of this pyramid are not bound by the obligations of protection that medieval lords were nominally had toward those beneath them. And so their self-interest is allowed to continue completely unchecked. Again, it'd be easy for me to point out the historical errors in this diagram, such as its inclusion of the clergy and of merchants, not to mention the fact that almost nobody in this actual image is from the Middle Ages. But what's most important here is that, again, we see an idea of medieval society being used to expose capitalism's myths of progress and freedom. Now, of course, this image is very much a medievalism of the left. But what's more common to encounter is a series of conflicting understandings of the Middle Ages from across the political spectrum. This is especially the case with one of the period's most cherished folk heroes Robin Hood, whose star has risen dramatically in the wake of the global financial crisis. Robin's basis in historical fact is not only obscure, but in many ways secondary to the very rich afterlife that he's had in the political cultures of both the left and the right. For those on the left, he's an icon of wealth redistribution, whose spirit lives on in this proposed Robin Hood tax, which aims to transfer wealth from the financial sector to those in need. For people on the right, Robin functions as an anti-taxation warrior. When this Robin redistributes wealth, it's away from government with its unfair taxes back into the hands of the people. And these two Robins stand together like twins of different parents, giving us simultaneously very similar images, and yet images that are so different from one another and inspire totally different forms of activism and represent totally different ideological commitments. My big idea then carries a challenge or perhaps an invitation to you. When you're reading or watching the news or even Game of Thrones, take notice of the potent role of the Middle Ages in today's political culture. Notice who gets called medieval, what gets called medieval, and why. And what this says not just about them, but about those who are calling them medieval. By doing this, you can recognise the very real ways in which we still need the distant past to help us talk about the present and think about the future. Thank you.